dokely. Everybody ready to have some fun? Let's do this. Welcome everybody to my studio. My name is Michael Markowsky, and today we're going to be making a painting together, maybe 2, 3, 5, 10, however many you want to make, because today is the kind of totally different episode from everything else that we've done so far. We're going to be exploring another one of my favorite artists. This time, this is an artist named JeanPaul Riopelle, who was a Quebec-born and raised artist from roughly around Montreal, born and raised. And although for many people they think of him potentially as a European artist or a French artist or specifically a Parisian from a Paris based artist, because he spent about 40 years of his life kind of at the around from his, I would say, 20s until his mid-60s in Paris. So he became really well known as a Parisian artist, and I think there's probably many people who don't really even know that he's Canadian, although of course people in Quebec celebrate him as probably the greatest painter to ever come out of the province, or out of Canada for that matter. So we are going to make some paintings based on his paintings, and his paintings are pretty wild. He's kind of the king of abstract painting, most often compared to Jackson Pollock. And I think that might be a great place for us to start, because I think Jackson Pollock is probably more familiar to most of you than JeanPaul Riopelle. So let's kind of maybe start there. And actually, maybe even before I jump into that, let's just, I just want to show a few things right off the top. This is the Facebook group, the private Facebook group that we've been running here, that includes all of the artwork that you guys are making and sharing with us. And in a few weeks, I'm going to do another video where I look at some of this artwork and give you feedback on the artwork, mostly just celebrating it because it's so awesome. And in many cases, you guys are exceeding me, which isn't surprising. I mean, that's kind of my goal as a teacher, to be teaching you things and then for you to even do a better job than I am, because maybe you have an opportunity to focus a little bit more than me, because I'm talking the whole time and switching all of this technology all around all the time. So anyway, I invite you to join the Facebook group and share some of your pictures there. Of course, at the very end of today's episode, you can always send them to me by Instagram. There's my Facebook page itself, Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat. I'm on all of them, not as active as much as I am on YouTube, obviously. But I would love to see what you create. Now, usually at this point, I also tell people, here's where you can download the template for today's painting. If you wanted to make the Monet painting or the Maud Lewis paintings, you could download let's say the Maud Lewis's case. There's a tracing version of the painting that you can transfer onto the canvas, and I've shown how to do that many times. Well, today, if you go into this folder and you look into the Riopelle folder, it's empty, because you're going to see pretty quickly it wouldn't make much sense to try to use a template to make the art that we're going to make. So let's just take a quick look at the art of JeanPaul Riopelle, and I think the first thing you're going to see right off the top of the bat is, first of all, it's abstract or non-representational artwork, right? You have so-called representational artwork. If you're trying to make a painting that looks like a dog or a cat, and therefore you're making a painting that represents them on canvas, well, the opposite of that would be non-representational art, or non-figurative art, or non-objective art, or abstract art, as some people would call it, right? So there's a bunch of different, and they all have slightly different meanings, but for our case, they're pretty much interchangeable. So if we look at his art, and this is also not necessarily representative of everything that JeanPaul Riopelle did, as we'll see very shortly here, But what we're seeing on the screen is definitely the stuff that he's most well known for, is this all-over abstraction. And if we look at Jackson Pollock, you're probably like, oh, okay, I guess basically did the exact same thing, right? So they're the same kind of artist. Who did what first? Who ripped who off? You know, and the answer to that, who did what first, I'm not actually sure. But I think, you know, people think of Jackson Pollock and this drip technique, which we'll do a little bit of today, that he sort of cornered the market on, and no one else can use that technique, which is kind of silly. It's like saying, well, I painted with a paintbrush, so I'm really the only, you know, anybody else who paints with a paintbrush, technically, I'm always going to be included in the conversation, right? So, it sounds a little bit ridiculous when you put it that way, but that's sort of what has happened with this kind of dripping abstract painting technique. So, just a quick comparison here. Jackson Pollock, born 1912, died in a drunken car wreck in 1956, versus JeanPaul Riopelle, born just a few years later, and then lived almost twice as long till the age of 78, and then died about 18 years ago or so. So I thought I would just kind of quickly just show you some images so that we can see a little bit about the difference of their technique. So here's a very famous photograph of Jackson Pollock. And Jackson Pollock, I don't have the photos available here, but I've been to the studio. I've stood on this floor in, where is that? Hamptons, New York, kind of a couple hours east of New York City. You can go visit his studio. It's well preserved. Super cool thing that happened while my wife and I were there was about 3 or 4 years ago. We happened to come in when Willem de Kooning's niece showed up, and she, by this point, was an elderly woman who was helped around, and she was so amazing because we were right there at the very end of the day, and she walked around and explained to us how Jackson Pollock made some of these paintings, because she was like 10 years old, 5 years, I can't remember how old she was at the time, and her father, Willem de Kooning, was kind of one of Jackson Pollock's great friends. Anyway, that was for me, it's like the coolest thing, being in Jackson Pollock's studio, and Willem de Kooning's relative being there and bringing it all to life with us. Just the two, or there was let me see, it was my wife and I, her and her, I think it was like her daughter or granddaughter or something. Anyway, so here's Jackson Pollock painting and using his famous drip technique, so much so that he was dubbed Jack the Dripper by the press. And then we'll look, where did I already thought? Oh, it's still on this page here. Look at the next photo. And here is JeanPaul Riopelle in his studio painting. Now, they both look very messy kind of situations. You can see the splatter all over the walls. But the big difference here is that JeanPaul Riopelle is painting with a canvas upright on an easel, while Jackson Pollock's painting is on the floor. And not only that, he's actually standing and walking all over it, sometimes kneeling on it and everything. And that is already a major distinction of how they painted. But the other thing is, Jackson Pollock would often paint on these huge canvases and do all of his painting, and then, you know, cut it into smaller pieces or keep the large, you know, like, so he would just decide, oh, I like this little bit here, and I'm going to trim this one out, and we'll have like 5 little pieces here. Maybe this one will be a bit bigger, and I'll turn it around. Whereas Riopelle, he stretched his canvas onto a frame, and he therefore painted the picture in a much more traditional approach, right? He knew what the boundaries of the picture were going to be before he even began the picture. And that might sound like, okay, yeah, whatever, but if you really think about it, if you're making, just like we're going to do today, you know, we're going to take a canvas And you know how big this canvas is when you get it, right? It's not just some giant sheet of canvas that you're painting on and then you decide, well, I like this little part, and I'm going to make 2 pictures. I mean, you could, of course, cut this in half on a table saw or with a really sturdy pair of scissors, but I think for an artist, that's a whole different approach, painting this way versus this way. Now, one of the ways that Riopelle would do some of these kind of drip techniques is he's taking his brush and whipping it with his wrist onto the canvas. And you can see on the walls, the ceilings, and the backs of other canvases splatter going all over the place. And look at his table. Look at these mounds of paint that have accumulated, right? So we are probably not going, I mean, if you want, you could certainly try it, but you might want to make sure you're maybe in your garage, away from your car, or outside, where if you're going to be trying that technique, you're not going to get paint all over your leather sofa and your white shag carpet or something, right? So we actually will be using a kind of a modified version of JeanPaul Riopelle's technique, and I think for our purpose we'll be doing it on a flat surface just to kind of prevent some of the wild splatters going all over the place. Okay, what else? So let's just kind of take a quick dive into his biography, and let's see. Let me see. This website, I put a link in the video description below, has an incredible, exhaustive biography on JeanPaul Riopelle that is well worth reading. I pretty much spent my whole day today researching Riopelle and his work and his technique, and this took me a few hours to go through, and really insightful, and a lot of stuff there I had no idea about whatsoever. So we'll just do I'll try to do this in about 5 minutes or less, just quick his biography. You know, born in Montreal, 1923. His father was a carpenter who spent most of his life building these kind of elevated steps, which if you've ever been to Montreal, is a super iconic part of the architecture or landscape. The urban landscape is these stairs that go up to the 2nd floor, which is kind of crazy because in a town where known for its ice storms, having to go up and down these stairs all the time is a little bit crazy and wild and slippery. But maybe it just makes for some fun adventure. Anyway, like a number of the artists we've talked about before, his father was not into the idea of him becoming an artist. You know, obviously recognized that he had talent, suggested he instead go to architecture school. So he started at an art school, and by being persuaded by his father, then tried architecture and eventually came back to art quite soon afterwards. And while he was in art school, he learned kind of the classical approach to painting. And we'll get into this as we go, because he was born in Quebec at that time, was a very conservative province, basically run by the Catholic Church. I mean, literally, this is stuff I didn't really realize about the history of Quebec, how powerful the Catholic Church was in the province. And until the 1960s and 70s, the hospitals and education, beyond a bunch of other things, were all controlled by the church. And, you know, so if you think about, like, it's a very conservative culture, and the art was also very conservative, right? So he took classes from this teacher, what was his name? Besson, right here, and learned of the very classical technique. His teacher did not think much of the Impressionist Claude Monet, who we painted the last episode, until he went to the École des Beaux-Arts and met this other teacher, Paul-Émile Bourdieu, who is probably the second most famous artist and writer from this period of time after Riopelle. Bolduas wrote or co-authored, I think he was the main author behind a number of texts, the most famous of which maybe we'll come up to shortly is called Refus Global, which was like a art manifesto, well, not even just an art manifesto, but a culture manifesto, and that was all about challenging the political and religious structure in Quebec at the time, and eventually was maybe one of the things often highlighted as the inciting incidents for what became known as the Quiet Revolution in Quebec in the 1960s, 70s, and then the effects of which still reverberate today. So he was obviously really let me see, I'm just going to zip through a number of things here. We can see his work. Once he started studying with Bolduas, his style changes quite radically. He becomes really interested in the Impressionists, Claude Monet particularly. He gets married, has a child, moves to France, spends, as I said, about 30 years in France. While he's there, he forms a relationship with Henri Matisse, the painter that did the goldfish painting we did, it seems like years ago now. So he became really good friends with his son, who had an art gallery. Pierre Matisse had one of like the most powerful art galleries in New York, and I think he had a satellite gallery in Paris. And from there, his career really blossomed. And he also met another painter. So you can see this style. Here's this flicking of the paintbrush kind of style. He met another artist named Joan Mitchell, not Joni Mitchell, but Joan Mitchell, who became, I don't think they were married, but they were partners for about 15 years and very good friends afterwards. And they lived together in Europe, France, and I think New York, and eventually in the, I think, late 70s, early 80s, Riopelle moves back to Canada. Another thing that Riopelle is very well known for, maybe even more than the drip technique or the splashing technique, is the use of the palette knife. And I would probably say Riopelle and another artist who came 100 years before him named Courbet, a French artist from France, would be the two artists that I would say, and then maybe Bob Ross, the three artists who are probably, in my mind anyway, who are most well associated with the palette knife as a tool for painting. And so we'll get into that. Let me see, anything else I want to talk about here? He's also, I guess another thing I want to mention just really quickly before we move on here is Riopelle is also very well known for his printmaking technique, and also a very unusual, non-traditional way of using printmaking. So he would often use a technique called decalmania, which is like making like a, based on, or the decal is the word that is probably most familiar, but often what it's used is for doing kind of like the Rorschach blot, like taking a piece of paper, folding it, like putting some paint on it, and folding it, and then peeling it apart, and then you've got this kind of mirrored image on both sides. And so he would make hundreds of these prints, and then often, instead of throwing them out if he didn't like them, he would cut them up, tear them apart, and then glue them back together to create even, like, some of these prints are huge. They're like 10 feet tall, these huge collages. He's also famous for doing sculpture as well. We're not even going to get into his sculpture, but if you've been to Montreal, especially during the Olympics in '76, you would have seen this sculpture, La Joute, which is this really, it's a fountain that has a fire feature added to it. So this flame lights up in the circular way, and these like in the middle of all these, the water feature shooting off, the flame turns on, and then at some point the fountains kind of appear to douse the flames, and it's like every half hour or so this thing, and it was famously moved. There was a big controversy about 10 years ago, and it's reopened. I'm trying to remember where this is. But you can watch videos if you're interested in watching that. He's also known for making these owls, and I think there's this really interesting quote. I won't get into it, but he talks about the difference between abstract and representational art here. And he talks about people saying his art is very abstract, and he says, oh, well, actually my most quote-unquote abstract art is what I consider my most representational art. And the art that people think is the most representational, like the ones where there's like birds and owls in it, is my most abstract art. It's just a matter of sort of the approach. Like when I think he talks about, I don't draw from nature, I go towards nature. Like he literally kind of embodying nature. So in that sense, really representing it. Like, so not just the look of it, because he talks about, like, if you're going to paint the sky, well, it's not like you're chiseling a piece of the sky out and putting on your canvas. You're making a kind of abstraction. You're just smearing a bunch of paint together that kind of looks like the sky. Anyway, let's get right into it. I could talk a lot more about his art. It's also very interesting. Again, he was a radical and a revolutionary, and there's a clip I also posted in the video description below. When he died, a bunch of his friends, names that I scrolled by really quickly earlier on there, who co-signed the Refus Global in the 40s, or late 49, I think it was published, boycotted his funeral because it was held inside of a church. And a lot of them were very anti church. Well, I don't think they were necessarily against religion, but just against the stranglehold that the Catholic Church had over Quebec at the time. So here's the painting that we're going to look at. You can see here, this painting sold for $7.4 million in 2017. Vent du Nord, which is the wind from the north, roughly translated, right? So let's go right into this. Let me see. I'll keep this up here for a second until I get the image up on the screen. So let me just stretch this out. Okay. So this is the first thing that I'm going to show you guys how to do. Now, a couple of things. One of which is I suggested that if you had the opportunity to get some medium, a pouring medium for today's class. Because what a pouring medium does is it what we would call extends the paint. It makes the paint go further, spread out more, but doesn't thin the paint as much. It does a little bit, it has to, but it doesn't, not in the way that water does. So pouring medium allows you to pour the paint, and which is perfect for what we're about to do today. So if you have this will work quite well. I'll show you how to do this in a second. But I think before we even do that, we're still going to prime these canvases. Now, what I've done is these are canvases that I bought, and the links to the actual brand, I think these the same one. So I've ordered 3 different ones off the internet because these canvas boards have been selling out all over town. And I've gessoed it, but I think for today's class, we are going to cover it with so much paint that it doesn't really matter if you put gesso on here or not, whether you sanded it or not. It's going to get covered. And since we're not really going to be painting in the most traditional way, I don't think it matters. So I have put gesso on here, but I don't think I'm even going to bother sanding it, right? So, but I do want I think if we look at this painting on the screen here, there is a lot of paint on here. So he's famous for building up quite thick layers of paint. and even at times literally squeezing paint onto the canvas, or in this case, if it's on an easel, squeezing some paint out of the tube and whipping it onto the canvas. So you get these globs of paint, right? And then he might take it and bang it, right, and shake it so that it kind of moves and slithers around on there, right? And then he would often, again, use maybe another canvas. So if this canvas is covered with paint, he might take this one, smush it on there. Oh, and now I've got two paintings, right? And then paint on it with a paintbrush or with a palette knife. You know, I mean, one thing, when I think about JeanPaul Riopelle, he to me seems like, you know, probably one of the first, like, multidisciplinary artists beyond people, like, I think the only name that really comes to mind is Pablo Picasso, because Picasso was an artist who was just sort of doing whatever, you know, whether it's ceramics or printmaking or painting or drawing or sculpture, or welding sculpture or clay, he would just grab whatever and use it, right? And Riopelle is very similar in that sense, is in that, yes, there's this, the painting we're seeing on the screen is what he's most known for, but he did everything else you could possibly imagine. And my impression is that, you know, he would make a painting like this, and then simultaneously be making a sculpture on the side, and be making some drawings and some prints, and so his studio would just be covered in all sorts of different kinds of work, some of which would be abstract like this, and then some of which would be a little bit more figurative and have like birds and animals and stuff in it. You know, not as in the same way that maybe a classical artist would paint them, but still elements of those animals in there. Anyway, so let's, what I want to do is I want to, just for the sake of time, we're not going to be able to build up this intense level of color and paint on here. It could take us literally weeks to do that, right? So we're going to try to create a couple of paintings in a much shorter period of time. So I'm going to put down some color just to get us started here. And we're going to explore a few different techniques while we do that. And I'm also going to say we can explore some of his techniques that don't involve using the pouring medium either. So if you don't have this pouring medium, don't worry about it for today, because I'm going to show you a few different ways that we can kind of make do without it. So let's get some paint out here. I usually sand my canvas down. I'm not going to do that today. Now, when you're pouring paint, you can end up using a lot of paint kind of quickly if you're not really prepared, and you can get a big mess really quickly. So when you're doing anything like this, being prepared is probably more useful than it is at any other time. So having some rags around, putting some paper down onto your table to help collect any over splatter or anything like that would be very, very helpful. So I'm just gonna, even though we're not gonna be painting in our traditional way, I'm still gonna put these up here just so people can see what colors I'm using as we go. Another thing is, you can see, I've got a big bucket here of paint. These are from the classes that I teach, and you can see here's the paint, you know, after people have squeezed almost all the paint out, and yet there's still a little bit of paint in here. So often what I do is I'll like cut the end off. Let me just show. You know, so often what I'll do is just take a pair of scissors and trim off the end, and then I'll scoop some paint out with a popsicle stick or with a spoon, right? And then I can put that onto my palette. And in this case, I could also literally just trim off the end and put some of the pouring medium inside, stir it in here. Or if you want, you can use a cup for that, right? So if you just want to use like an old coffee cup, or you have some plastic cups from the dollar store, you can use those. But this kind of thing will also work well if you have a little bit of extra paint. So this is also a great thing to do at the very, when all of your paints at the end of this class are empty or on the verge of being done, maybe you want to make some Riopelle paintings, right? And get a little bit messy, instead of just tossing out a tube that still has some workable paint, but you're really struggling to get that last little bit of paint out of it. Other things, if you do want to kind of go a little bit nuts, you can get like these, big, this is just house paint from the hardware store. And I'm one of those guys, it drives my wife absolutely bonkers, but when I go to the hardware store to get something very specific, I often do a little spin around the paint aisle and just see if they have any of these, what are they called, tints, like tints of paint that they, somebody's got it mixed and they're like, oh, I don't like that color. And they're like, okay, well, we'll put it on sale for $10 or something, as opposed to $30 or more, right? So I'm often just going around and I pick these things up for this very reason, so that I can do stuff like that. So if you have some old house paint lying around, house paint, whether it's acrylic or oil-based paint, is perfect for today's activity. In fact, it does exactly what I shouldn't say it replicates pretty closely what the pouring medium does to the paint. Obviously, it's not intended to be put on canvases, whether it's going to last 100 years or versus which ideally your acrylic paint that you use for your paintings should last much longer. Okay. So let me just, so I'm going to put down some paint on here, and let's see. I think, thinking of Riopelle today, I'm going to just get rid of my palette. Because he squeezed paint right out onto the canvas, so I'm going to do the exact same thing, right? So that's why I said today's going to be a little bit different. Should be a lot more fun here. These things that start, we're getting towards, we've been painting for 5 months on paintbrushes that cost us, what, $10? So when they start to fall apart, it's like, okay, well, they've had a good run, haven't they? Just trying to secure that on there. Okay. So if we look at this painting, I see that there's some yellows, and what I would say is, if I'm going to make a painting that's going to get really dense like this, and I might be using a lot of black and browns and dark blues, then what I would want to do is to put maybe a brighter color, it could be a very bright or a tinted brown or a tinted blue or tinted red. But if you really want something a little bit more intense, you could use some like yellow or a bright red, even like a cool blue maybe, as like your underpainting, so that at least there's that brighter color that's going to shine through. So I don't know exactly how he painted this picture. He probably was also splattering some of this yellow paint on there, but again, just to help build up this surface and give it the illusion of a lot of paint, I'm going to use some of these brighter colors just to lay down to get started here. So let's see. Yeah, which view should we use here? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my paint. I'm going to squeeze some paint out onto the canvas. And so this is my cool yellow. Right, so that not insubstantial amount of paint, right? And maybe even, why don't we put a little bit of this cool blue? It's a little bit lighter. Maybe not as much. I don't want too much on here. Okay, so I've put a bunch of paint there onto my canvas. Now, oh, maybe it looks great like that as we're ready to go. Now, so he might do this, and this might be on an easel, and he might be flicking the paint right out of the tube, right? So if he had paint in here, I'm just gonna be careful I don't get it all over the computer, but squeeze a little bit out and go, and we might get a onto the canvas. Now, I'm not going to do that here because, again, I've got all my computer stuff and school stuff all over the place. But that would be an option. The other thing we can do is we can use a palette knife. And, or actually, so I'll just show you, here's my collection of palette knives. And I did have another one. Oh yeah, here we go. All right, so all of these could work, but what I think I want is I want a palette knife that's got a square edge. Kind of more like, let's see if you can, kind of like on a screwdriver, right? So, but, you know, I don't have one here to use that would work really well for Riopelle's style. So instead of using a palette knife that doesn't work, one thing you can use, especially if you've got canvases, is you may have noticed in when you buy a stretched canvas, often when you buy like a stretched canvas, you'll see these kind of things kind of stapled inside there somewhere, right? It's often kind of inside the plastic. You wonder, like, what on earth are these? Maybe they put them in there by accident. Is the painting falling apart? Are these? What these are for is, so maybe I'll just quickly demonstrate this, because people ask me this all the time, like, and the reason why you would take this is you can take them, and these aren't made for this brand, but you could take them and kind of hammer them into the corners to spread the corner out a little bit more. So if you find you've bought a canvas like this and it just feels really saggy, right, you could take these in and hammer them in to help spread the canvas open, and that will stretch the canvas out even just a little bit more. I usually just, well, I was going to say toss them in the garbage, but I'm really bad. I rarely toss anything in the garbage. But you can use these types of things to do some of the spreading of the paint, like a palette knife. The other thing you can do is, like, here's a postcard. Here's a postcard from an exhibition I did where I built an airplane inside of an art gallery. Maybe I'll just show you here real quick. So this is an installation I did at the Kamloops Art Gallery a few years ago for an exhibition where I flew inside of a fighter plane and made drawings in the fighter plane at this faster than the speed of sound. That's what the show is called, Faster Than the Speed of Sound. And then built this airplane that little kids could climb, anybody could climb inside and pretend they're flying the plane and be surrounded by these giant paintings I made. Anyway, so here's a postcard. Oh, here's me in the fighter plane with the Royal Canadian Air Force up in Cold Lake. But what I thought we could do is literally take a postcard like this, and we can create palette knives for ourselves. So we can use just a piece of kind of cardstock. Maybe you've got something in your recycling bin, and if you find that this is too thin and too wobbly, well, what we can do is take it and make, let's say, a thicker one, right? And if we find that that's still too wobbly, then we can make another one, right? and so on and so forth as we spread this paint. So let's just try this out right now. And actually, maybe before I even do that, I just want to find a painting of his that looks a little bit like this. Where's... okay, so here's a good one. So this painting, this is at the National Gallery in Ottawa, and this is based on, oh, it won't let me enlarge it much. That's a bummer. Let me see if I just expand this outwards just so we can see. This painting is done using a palette knife. It's, again, it's hard to really see it on the screen here. But that's kind of what I'm going to try to replicate to get started here with this this technique. So I'm going to take one of my homemade palette knives. Let's just try the very thin one here. Oops. All right, so we can take this, and then we can just kind of smoosh it down. All right, maybe I take this. And often what he would do is something kind of like staggering them out a bit, right? Now, if you want, you could just go wild and spread it all around. I'm going to do a little bit of this. You can see we don't need a palette knife to do, or any pouring medium as of yet to do any of this. All right, I'm just randomly spreading it around. You know, again, if you found that this was too flexible, then you could move up to another one, right? This one's got this kind of spread, it's just folded in half. And then maybe let's say I'm going to use this one for a different color. And don't worry if the colors mix or anything, because we kind of want that to happen. Now, if you wanted, you could do something like take a big stroke and move it like down here. Right? There's no rules saying that you have to do one thing one way or the other. Right? You could do a combination of it. Right? If we look at so I would invite you to do a little playing around like this and build up the surface, cover the whole surface in this way. And this is also, quite frankly, if you've made a painting that you're not happy with, rather than just tossing it in the garbage, is be like, okay, well, you know what? This is an opportunity to really have some fun with it. Now I've got a canvas that needs some extra attention. Well, let's try making a Riopelle painting on top of it. I mean, who knows how he came to this technique? Maybe it was that very same kind of approach. Maybe he was making a painting. It wasn't turning out And he just was like, I'm just going to grab the palette knife and scrape it. And then as he was doing it, thought like, whoa, wait a second, this is kind of cool. Right, so there's no logic as to how I'm applying this at all. I'm just trying to cover the surface of this picture. Right, and so you don't worry about like, oh no, he went right there and I went left. Ugh, time to start over. Right? So you'll find, like, again, if you have a so-called a real palette knife, you can use those for this. I find it's just kind of, I actually really like using non-traditional materials, like just a piece of folded up cardboard or cardstock. Okay, so now I've got a bunch of the yellow spread out a little bit. Maybe I'm just gonna, rather than just immediately going in and smudging it, I'm just gonna turn to this other side here, and let's do this with the blue. And I'll try to get some, like a bunch of blue that doesn't have any green in to get started, because I don't want just to leap right there just yet. And remember, if you don't like the way this looks, we're about to start dripping and pouring paint all over it, splattering paint all over it. So this gives you like a lot of freedom to really play. Right? Art, I think, is one of those, is like one of the only places in culture or for grown-ups to play like little children. You know, like I sit around all day today just playing with my daughter and watching her, just her imagination kind of going wild as she picks up toys, and she can't even speak yet, but she can, you know, she has toys that she likes more than other toys, and she's babbling to them, and it's, you know, if anyone out there is a psychologist or a therapist, they know that it's not just child's play, as you would say. There's lots of stuff going on in her little mind there where she's figuring out the world. Right? You look at animals in the wild, bears and foxes, you know, they're crawling all over each other and chasing one another around. Okay. So I've almost got this whole thing covered, which is my priority here, is just to cover the canvas. Now there's certainly nothing stopping you from continuing with this process as it is and creating a finished painting in this very same way, right? You could mix colors. I mean, you could paint any of the paintings we've done so far using this same technique. Obviously, you're going to get a very different result than we did originally with a paintbrush, but there's nothing stopping you from attempting it. and you may even like the results more. Like I'll show you in a second here. We'll go back to his painting of an owl, and you could see, like, well, I don't know if I really see an owl in there. It looks like a bunch of just paint scribbled all over the place, but does it really matter what you or I think about it? If he's enjoying himself, he finds it rewarding. Right, like I'm kind of like digging the way this looks right now, to be quite honest. I'm like, oh, I don't know, maybe do I really want to be splattering paint all over this thing? I don't know. If you had little children and you wanted to do, you could even take, let's say, like a little toy car and just be driving it around back and forth over top of this, and you could get some cool results from it, right? There's nothing saying that that's the right or wrong way to do things. I always like covering up these edges here, so I'm just going to take some of this extra paint. I'm just going to run my finger on these edges here. Take paint right off the face of the picture like I just did. It's totally up to you. Like, I think one of the things that I would hope you get out of not just this painting and JeanPaul Riopelle, but out of this course entirely is not being so precious with your paintings. Like, allow them to get a little bit funky, allow them to get a little bit weird, allow them. Don't worry about it looking quote-unquote right. Get your fingers in there. I mean, you could do this whole thing with fingers, right? You could be going up and down here with your finger if you don't have a palette knife. Okay, so I'm going to set this to dry for just a couple of minutes. While I do that, just going to take a quick look to see if I can find that owl. I think we did look at it briefly, and then I zipped away from it, so. Where would it be? Maybe just quickly. So I mentioned that, some of his art is not entirely abstract, right? That here's some paintings. He was noticing the geese that would fly over his house all the time. So he started kind of making these paintings. So this is by JeanPaul Riopelle. This is in 1980, right? So this is, he's at this point maybe in his mid-60s. The work that we're doing right now, he did probably in his 40s, late 30s, 40s. So here's one of those images. Here's one I was saying about an owl. So he was really big into owl looks, right? So we still see a kind of silhouette of an owl in here, right? You could make your painting right here. You could develop this into an owl shape, right, if you wanted. So I'm just going to look here in the comments while I wait for this to dry for a second. M. Taylor says, thank you for choosing this artist. Thank you for tuning in and watching. I mean, you might have, I think somebody did suggest him a while ago. I don't know if it was you, but definitely thought like, oh yeah, because I was thinking about doing Jackson Pollock, and I think I will do one later on, not as part of this course, because we're going to end, I think, at episode 45, and then I'm going to do something different, which I've already mentioned briefly before. But I thought, you know, let's do a Riopelle one. He's somebody, instead of, maybe he hasn't been investigated quite as much. Sue says, you can make your own pouring medium with PVA glue and water. Yeah, you can use, so PVA glue is essentially white glue, or Elmer's glue. So you can use glue and water, yeah, that would work. I mean, pretty much your acrylic medium is just a really high-grade version of glue, right? Paint, I think I mentioned this in the very, very, very first episode, is, you know, when we're talking like what is paint? Paint is essentially a medium with a pigment. And there's all sorts of different kinds of mediums. There is oil medium to make oil paint. You've got acrylic paint. You've got different kinds of acrylic paint, like house paint acrylic and artist's acrylic paint. You've got gouache. You've got watercolor, tempera. You've got, I mean, what are some? I'm sure there's a few others that I'm missing, but. And so you can, like, Leonardo da Vinci painted the Sistine Chapel with, like, a crazy mixture of all sorts of different kinds of things that sort of didn't work, and it was falling apart as he's painting it. So, you know, basically your Elmer's glue is what is in a regular acrylic paint. It's just a different, slightly different chemical makeup. But that's why you can glue things onto a canvas just using your acrylic paint, because it's got that same sort of binder in it. Deborah says, I love the steps in Montreal, and there are the same in some parts of Gatineau where I live. Yeah. I wonder why those stairs are so common. I haven't really thought about it. Is it something to do with the water table? Is it because, are there, I don't think I've ever been in a basement in Montreal. I think maybe that's it. Maybe there's just no basements there, so everything is kind of multi-level. Deborah says, we still have old thinkers here in Quebec. At the same time, Quebec, I think because of that cultural revolution that happened in the 60s and 70s, was also became in some ways more progressive than other parts of Canada too. Kind of made a little bit of a flip and switch, you know, and you know, every culture is like that. There's parts of every culture that are a little bit more forward and a little bit more backward, depending on how we look at it, right? Sue says, I've been able to get boards at Walmart lately. Okay, so I think Walmart's been tuning into these episodes and just trying to help you guys out. Deborah says, it looks like a garden. Cool. Having problems painting or typing while you're painting. Tell me, I know exactly what you're talking about. And Irene says, I looked in my drawer and found a plastic 6-inch ruler, which is working great. So, you know, at this stage, you could, if you want, make multiple versions of this, using a few different colors, if you like. And they don't all have to be bright colors either, right? I mean, I just said that just because it might be a little bit easier to have some contrast between the light and the dark, but I think that will work. I'm just going to use my hair dryer just to kind of speed up this process. Now, there's nothing wrong with applying the paint at this stage. In fact, I wonder, part of me wonders if I just do half of it, I blow dry half of it, just so we can see what might happen if we pour the pouring medium onto this, where parts of it are dry and parts of it are wet. So let's do that. So, yeah. So how about, let me put, I'm gonna put a little bit of red on one side, and that will be the side that, well, I don't know which, I'll make a decision here in a minute what I'm gonna do on the red side, if that's the side that gets blow dried or not, but. This might help us identify one over the other. So yeah, I'm gonna try to just gonna blow dry this right side, and then we'll keep this side the wet side, and we'll just see what if anything it changes. Okay, I'm not gonna keep on. I could be blow drying this forever. One, let me see if we look at it from. Not sure how well it shows up on camera, but the parts that are very thin paint, that is dried very quickly, and it's even dried pretty much on this side. It's the part where we have the texture, where there's a lot more paint, where it's still very wet. You know, see, I touch it, it's still wet there, just as it would be over here. So, which is not surprising. The thicker the paint, the longer it's going to take to dry. What will happen inevitably is once this dries, a lot of this texture will disappear. So if you really like this this look of these kind of little mountains on here, and you just use the acrylic as it is right now, you could be a little bit disappointed. You could come back, let's say you leave it overnight, and you go like, oh, well, that's a bummer. All that really cool, all those peaks have disappeared. That was my favorite part of this painting. It kind of just looks like a big blob, but at least the texture was cool. And now there's no texture. What am I going to do? Right? Well, the answer to that is another painting medium. Now, you're like, oh, now I got to get something else. No, you don't have to go get anything else, but I'll just kind of point out, I guess it doesn't show up on the camera very well, but let me see. So this is what's called modeling paste. And modeling paste is if we just take, oh my goodness, some of these things here, let me just zoom back out. I think I have to use the table to open this up. If you ever have jars like this that aren't opening, my little technique is you want to try to squeeze the paint away from the lid. And you can hear that. I can hear it popping away. There we go. There we go. Because the paint will adhere, it'll dry to that surface. So, come on. And by the way, if you ever have, you know, these little skins that are included in the paint, and if you've ever got like a bottle of Tylenol or ibuprofen, right, and they often come with this like seal over there, which is helpful so that, you know, it hasn't been tampered with. I always keep these things because they also help reseal. Even if it's not perfectly sealed, it helps keep that paint as dry as possible, or I guess or as wet as possible inside the jar, because sometimes these lids aren't really airtight, right? So even a little bit of this can just slow down the process. So This, let me see, grab. So this material, this modeling paste or molding paste, or is, or it might be called like thickening gel. There's a number of different kinds. There's slight. You ever seen a paste in a gel? Is often one is transparent, and one is white or black colored. The paste is usually colored. The gel is usually transparent. So you would just mix this right into the paint. I believe this goes on white, but I don't think it it looks white, but I don't think it actually colors the paint at all. I can't quite remember. But anyway, if you were to mix this in to your paint, and maybe I'll do another one if we have a little bit of time. I'll actually use a little bit of this paste. But you're probably like, oh no, he's going to make another painting. We're going to be here all night again. Okay. Okay. So, but this is good enough for right now, right? So now I think let's start using the pouring medium, and we're going to start getting some drips and splatters and splashes onto this surface. So one of the first things I'm going to do, as I mentioned before, is just do a little bit of prep, just so that when all of this paint starts going all over the place, not only is it easy to clean up, but if I want to move this, it's easier to move, right? Because that could be one thing. You're like, oh, you know what? I'm ready to, and then you've got all this paint, and you're like, oh, I want to move this over there, but my hands and my shoes and every part of me is covered with paint, and now I've got to, so laying the paper down wherever else that this painting is going to dry overnight is really important. That's also a part of this process. So I've got a couple of pieces of newspaper already spread out on the floor. So I'm just going to put a canvas here. If you're getting really, really wild, a couple things you might want to think about is going to like the dollar store and getting like a tub, like a Rubbermaid plastic bin that your painting can sit inside. So if the paint runs over the edges, it just collects inside of the tub, and therefore you're not like, oh no, I've got paint, coming all over. It's about to drip onto the floor. Again, so what I've got here are these painter's pyramids. I think that's what they're called. And they look like this. You get them at Home Depot or any hardware store. And they're good because you can, as you can see in the video, right, I can balance my painting on top of it. So if there is drips coming off, then it's just gonna, it just makes the cleanup just a little bit easier. Okay, so I've got that. Let's, I'm gonna move that back out of the way though for a second as I start getting my paint medium together here. Okay, so I'm going to do a few different things. I'm going to mix one. I should have got, do I have any clear cups? I didn't think about that. Maybe. I'm just going to use this cup that I'm using to store all those. I'm just going to use this. This is like I think from a, I don't know, it was a ice cream jar or something, right? So what I'm going to do is let's put some white paint in here. All right, so I'm just going to start slow here. I'm not going to use a whole bunch of paint right off the top, just so we can kind of understand how this process works. Right, so I've got my pouring medium. I've got this big jar. It's pretty much exactly the same thing. All these different brands. I mean, it's. If I can get the lid off of this. Oh. There we go. So, This next part is kind of trial and error. The more of this you put, the more pouring medium you put in here, the more fluid it gets, right? So if you want something really super liquidy, then you put more in there. If you want something that's just a little bit more liquid, then you put a little bit in there. I know it sounds obvious, but you could really spend like the rest of your life trying to find the exact right mixture you want. And often, to be quite honest, different colors can sometimes have different properties and are already a little bit more thick or thin, viscous or what's the opposite of viscous? Non-viscous. So let's put in here, that's about half the amount, right? So we'll just do a quick little demonstration. So inside of here, I put about half as much paint medium as my color. Okay, and then we can just kind of hold your paintbrush up, and you can see, is this wet or drippy enough for my needs? Not dripping very far, or much at all, right? So let's just add a little bit more. Okay. So this is, again, it's kind of hard for me to tell you how much to put in or not to put in. I think it's always obviously easier to just add a little bit more each time, give it a good little stir, because you want to make sure that that paint is kind of well blended in there. You don't want kind of a bunch of paint in some, like, so you don't want it chunky. You know, so just give it a nice little stir up here. Then let's just see how this goes. Still a little wet. Alright, it's coming off, but let's try it again. Okay. And it's easy to kind of overdo it. You know, you're like, nothing's happening. I'm just going to go blub, 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 blub. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's really, really wet. So you just take a little bit of patience and just kind of get it to the mixture we like. Right now you can see. So I would say what I have in here is about 1.5 to 2 times the amount of paint. So if in other words, I have, let's say, 1 part acrylic paint, heavy body paint, and 1.5 or 2 parts acrylic pouring medium, right, to get this particular mixture that I have right here. And again, it depends on how long this paint has been, you know, out of the tube. It depends on how humid your environment is. You know, there's all sorts of different kinds of factors which will play into this process for you. So, now the moment of truth. Let me just kind of back this out a bit. Just move that out of the way. I should also mention that in, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to be using this material again to be doing some a Damien Hirst spin painting and doing some actual pouring. So if you've ever seen people doing these things called like a dirty pour, where they put paint in the cup and they put it down and then they pull it off and the paint spreads, we're going to do something like that, and you're going to want that this paint pouring medium for that purpose. So, but we're not there yet today. We're just introducing this material. So now we can take this and we can kind of dribble and splatter it on here as you wish. And then you might go, you know what, okay. Right, so his technique is kind of this, right? You're like, okay, well, I don't know, it's not really splattering as much as possible. Well, then we add more pouring medium. So this is the part, if you don't have this medium, you could add a little bit of water to your mixture. In fact, maybe I'll do a little bit of that just so we can see how water itself will work in this. Right, so here we can now put this on here. Okay, so let's bring up the original painting again, just so we can see how things are progressing. Okay, so you can see I might need to do dozens and dozens and dozens of layers on here. The other thing with paint pouring medium is because it is much more fluid, it will mix and blend with other wet colors very easily. So we're going to add more colors here in a few minutes, and it's possible that those colors will blend together on the canvas. And if you want that to happen, that's great. If you don't want that to happen, well then what you would want to do is just let the paint dry. Let it dry overnight, use the hair dryer. The one thing with using the hair dryer is it may move the paint around. It might start blending that paint. Right, so for instance, let me see. I'll just show you right now what would happen if I use the hair dryer. Okay, so very little to anything happened. I was expecting it to go like and shoot right off the side, but that's because I guess my paint pouring medium wasn't as thick as I thought it would be. So it's actually surprisingly, you know, even though I was able to get a bunch of those splatters, you can see the texture when I tilt it, right? You can see it's not in an insubstantial amount of texture on here. It will self-level a bit. It will kind of go down. So just kind of to be mindful of that. It won't have the same level of thickness as it dries. But let's mix a different color now. So let's see. What's the next color we should put? Maybe I'll put these side by side so we can see this. And what other color could we use here? I think let's go for just for some red. I mean, why am I overthinking this? Well, let's see, which one do we want? Let's move that higher. And you know, ideally, one of the things that, you know, when we do this in a class, I suggest to people get things kind of organized ahead of time so that you're ready to go. I'm going to put just this other medium from a different brand on here. So you can see I think this one must be a new one. Alright, so as I said, what I'll do is I'll keep this little piece of plastic there, and I'll fold it back down afterwards. But fact, I don't even need to use this. So right now there's, you can see kind of a big glob of paint in there. Oops, that's a lot. And just for our sake, I'll use a spoon. I think it's a lot of fun to put the brushes away for a couple of for just one day. I'm going to use, rather than the spoon side of the spoon, the concave or convex side of the spoon, I'm just going to use the other side. You could use a popsicle stick or even the other side of your paintbrush for this. All right, that's nice. But I think I'm just going to add just a little bit more even. All right, so, you know, when I'm done, right, I'm just gonna, I've got this little foil on the top, and now that's just gonna help ensure that that medium just stays as fresh inside there as possible. Now, I could change this color as well, right? I don't have to just accept the color I put in there, so maybe let's do that. Let's put some of my, so this is a warm red I put in here. Let's put a little bit of cool or warm yellow, sorry. And we'll get a little bit of more of an orange color. Okay. So I'm not really noticing any, remember I said I blow dried 1/2 of the canvas, and you know, it doesn't seem to have made any impact whatsoever as to how the paint mixed at this point anyway. If I was using some water in my mixture, that would probably have a little bit of an effect. In fact, what we'll do is right after this, let's make a mixture just using water and the paint. And you're going to see it will really be very different than this, but not, you know, a deal breaker. I would also suggest, as you're doing this, not to use up all of the color all at once. Like, save a little bit, and then you can kind of come back and add some of that later. Like, so for instance, where I've got this white, then you can get this kind of a web look. Another thing, too, that Riopelle would do is he might often even take his palette knife and go back into the painting as well. So let's just do, so he might take his palette knife and then just start making some lines into the picture. And I know some of you are like, no, it was so pretty. Oh no, right? But I mean, we're having fun here, right? So he might do a little bit, make these incisions. Right, you can see how it is going to help make some of that paint blend. If you didn't want that paint to blend, you just want to let it dry, right? And then you can put another layer over top of it. Okay, so I still got those colors off to the side. So let's try. Oh, wow, my old friend Mary Al from Los Angeles is joining us. Hi, Mary, nice to see you. It's been a long time. It's been since the last time I was down there, 5 years. Great to see you again. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, let's add, what color should we put in here? Maybe we'll put a, let's say, a warm blue, and I'm going to put a little bit of water into the paint this time, just to kind of shake things up a bit. So, there's kind of like 3 blobs of paint in there, kind of, you know, about twice as much as I normally put on my palette when I'm painting, right? So I'll put that in, and I'm going to just put water directly in there. I was thinking about putting a little bit of white to lighten it, but if I put water in there, it's going to make it a little more transparent anyway, so... Mary is a very accomplished, famous pianist, piano player, a great friend of mine, and she teaches and has really good taste in food as well. Okay, so I put, how much water would I say I put in there? There's probably about maybe 1-to-1 water and paint. I'm stirring it up really well. So I could take this from the cup and drip it out. That might be a little bit too out of control for my purpose, so I'm just going to take a spoonful of this, and then we can drip it around here. You can see it's, I don't quite get the same kind of long, serpentine, sinewy kind of marks that I get when I'm using those mediums. It works, and you can see what is happening. Maybe I'll zoom in here. Is the paint is mixing a little bit more than it normally does. So you can see how the paint, the blue paint, is really activating in there. And so if you like that, that's great. If not, then maybe you don't want to use water in your paint. I'm just going to use the hairdryer. Now that there's water in here, I think we're going to see this start to move around a lot. Now I want to be careful, because if I just go nuts, then this is all going to start blending together and then just create a big brown mush, right? And it's just going to look like somebody vomited onto the canvas, which maybe that's what you're trying to express. Maybe you're not feeling well and you want that look. But, so I'm going to blow dry it. We'll see how that affects things. Okay, that looks pretty cool. Now, again, there's some people out there who would look at this and be horrified. Maybe there's some of you who are at home looking at this or what you're making right now and are like, this is, you know, I can appreciate it, but not my cup of tea at all. And then there's some of you that are like, wow, this is my jam. This is so cool. I love doing this. I don't really feel very good about my ability to mix paint or to draw, but this is fun. And that's really what I'm trying to get across in this class, is to show you as many different types of art and different painting strategies, different ways to apply paint, because it's more than just painting a picture of goldfish and cats. We can do all sorts, we can glue things on here, we can pour and splatter and transfer, right? So what I want is that would make me really happy if there are some people that are kind of like, oh, I finally found this is how I can express myself. Now, it's not, if it could be done for you if you want. If you're like, yeah, okay, I'm pretty satisfied, yeah, looks good, then you're done, right? Then you just set it aside, let it dry. Again, you want to make sure that you have, you know, if you're going to set this on your kitchen counter or something to dry overnight, I would be very careful to have not just one piece of newsprint, but a few pieces of newsprint, that, because if this starts dripping overnight, or let's say you got a cat that knocks it up and then the paint drips and it pools, it could soak through the newsprint and then get onto and stain your kitchen countertop or your table or something. So again, being very prepared is super helpful. It's always it's one of those things that you don't really think about it until you don't prepare, and then you suffer the consequences for it afterwards, and you're like, oh no, right? So if you're prepared, nothing happens, then you're like, oh, I don't know why I went to all that trouble and nothing happened. It's only when the trouble happens that you instantly regret it. So what could we do here? I think I like these colors quite a lot, actually. I think I want to go back to this cool blue that I had earlier, and I'm going to put some of that back on top. Because I think one thing that's nice is when we have colors coming from under back onto the top, and we create this kind of web of colors moving in and around one another. So I'm just going to take another cup. And oh, this one's got some old coffee residue in there. Oops. So, you know, with this, you know what? I'm going to use some Elmer's glue. Give me 1 second here. I'll just show you all the different. Okay, so here's, you know, a bottle of just regular Elmer's glue, right? This is, you know, I got at the dollar store for $1. And I'm going to mix this into here. I've got, you know, about, you know, again, if I was putting toothpaste on my toothbrush, this would be enough for like 3 nights worth of toothbrushing, right? About 3 times. Okay, so that's just kind of a couple big gobs in there. You can see how scientific I am about this, right? And I know that, you know, if I was doing this for a professional artwork that I was planning on selling to somebody, I probably wouldn't be mixing I wouldn't mix, you know, this Elmer's glue into here with all these acrylic mediums, because this is not made for painting with, right? It's a much cheaper material. Who knows what's really in here? So I'm going to put a little bit of water. Actually, maybe that's a little much. Well, let's, yeah. It's always better to mix just what you need. See how it works. Rather than have too much, and then you're like, if you've got too much paint and glue in there, then you have to add, or if you've got too much water in there, then you've got to add more paint to balance it out. Before you know it, you've used a whole tube of paint in there, right? And then you've got all this extra stuff that you don't have any use for. Okay, so here's the Elmer's glue with paint. I don't expect it to be much different at all. That's actually, I'm actually surprised at how I've never used the Elmer's glue for this, but I know that I've read elsewhere people say it works. There's the paint pouring community is huge. If you're really getting into paint pouring, you will find that there's many people who are into it, and there's many YouTube videos. I can't remember her name, but there's one woman who does like one of these every day, and she has like a spreadsheet that she provides for free, which you can download, that shows her experiments and how much she used of each material. Okay, so I like that. That's pretty cool. It's pretty wild. I'm gonna go back in here with some of this white. Remember I said don't use up all that paint? This is why. Now it's dry. Well, I was gonna say it dried out a little bit, but another thing to think about is going right to the edges. Because I think a lot of the times what ends up happening is we got this big lump of paint right in the middle. Think about getting a little bit closer to these edges, and even like the paint going over the edge and off the side. Okay. Now, if I look at one of the big features here of Vendinal is the black. So he's using, it could be a really dark blue, but it's possibly also black. So it's up to you to decide. I mean, I actually really like the way that this looks at the moment. I like these really bright colors. But in the interest of trying to get as close to Riopelle's painting as possible, I'm going to put a little bit of black on there. So let's can't think if I've exhausted all my options yet. I've done painting medium. Let me see. One thing we haven't used is the matte medium. So if there's anybody out there who has matte medium and is like, oh, all I've got is my matte medium, let's try to use a little bit of the matte medium. So, and we might need to add a little bit of water in there. So here's some black. I'm probably not going to put too much on here, even though his has, well, let's get a little bit more. Okay. Some of these tubes of paint haven't been opened in a long time. Okay, so let's put some. So right now, I would say there's about 2-to-1 matte, medium, and black paint in here. I'm going to stir this. You probably can't see against my black or my dark blue shirt. But I'm going to add a little bit of water in here just because it's not... Probably shouldn't do it right over the top of that painting, should I? Okay. So, and then let's just... Of course, you could turn your canvas, you know, depending, you know, if you feel like, oh, I'm not able to get paint in that one area. Well, you know, our body will only move in certain directions, right? So you might have to rotate the canvas to get at those areas. And again, if you wanted to use the palette knife to then scrape back in here and to draw back over top of it, you could do that. I think it's worth sort of mentioning right at this moment, you can see how brightly colorful this painting is. And one of the interesting things that I was reading about Riopelle is he was really attracted to bright colors because when he was a little boy, his brother, I think it was his brother, died, and I think his brother was like 10 years younger than him, and his brother, and according to the tradition, the sort of burial funeral rite in Quebec at the time was to dress, everybody would dress in white. And the body would be wrapped or the body would be dressed in white clothes and then wrapped in white fabric, and you know, of course the priests in the church, everybody was wearing white, and for him it was like a real, like, in fact, every time it snowed afterwards, it kind of gave him anxiety because it was like this PTSD flashback to his brother dying, and so ever since then he was really attracted to bright colors, because they didn't remind him of his brother being dead, right? And when I was reading, like, oh, that's so interesting. Now, I'm sure there's maybe an oversimplification. I mean, this is what he himself said, but it is interesting, nevertheless, to think about, like, how, you know, our own life experience, you know, influences the choices that we make, whether it's just color or materials. I'm just was thinking right now, how am I going to sign this painting when it's covered in paint? I probably won't be able to sign it until until it's dry, right? So I also hope you could see why it was helpful to have that yellow that we put on originally there first, right? If we had put a black down and then put these colors on, it would just be a very dark, dark painting. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, the last painting we did, the Claude Monet painting, was very subtle, right? You know, in fact, you know, if last night or a couple nights ago after I finished it, my wife and I are sitting there looking at it, and they just sort of like when all the lights are off and there's our Christmas tree still up. By the way, happy Ukrainian Christmas. I'm half Ukrainian, and we're going to have Ukrainian dinner tonight, a Christmas dinner. Anyway, you know, it's very, very subtle. So there's nothing wrong with creating a painting, even like this, that is super subtle, right? That it might just look like a big black painting, but you get up and you say, whoa, look at all those grays and dark browns and dark blues and dark yellows. That's really cool. It doesn't have to be really bright saturated colors like the one we're making today. Okay. So I'm just going to put a few more touches on here, and then I think we're ooh, that was a big blotch of red on there. And I think the color in Riopelle's paintings are definitely one of the striking differences between him and Jackson Pollock. If we go back to these, you know, the very beginning of today's episode where I was talking about the similarities and differences between them, Jackson Pollock's paintings are almost entirely very earthy grays and browns and yellows, right? You know, blue, like dark blue, black, versus Riopelle's, very few of them are really dark. You know, in fact, Vent du Nord, this painting here, it might be one of the darkest paintings he did, right? So, I think that's really interesting to see that the differences in that way. Okay. I think, you know, I'm going to take this off, and I'm going to move this newsprint out of the way, just because I want to be able to see it without so many things covering it, and just see how I feel about it. Now that newsprint, you know, it's got color and stuff all on it as well, and of course this is a green background. Yeah, does it look anything like the painting by JeanPaul Riopelle? Not really. But of course, like I've said many times, replicating the painting is not really my goal. It's about learning about these different techniques and learning a little bit about the artists themselves. But I think I'd be very happy with that so far. It'll be interesting to see what happens to this painting when it dries. I'm expecting a lot of the texture to disappear. I'm expecting, as it dries, to become more and more flat. And it won't go completely flat, but it won't be like it is right now. So that's another thing to consider. If you really like the thickness of these paintings and you'd want to add, you know, I'd be trying to think, That would be... you know what I would expect is the pouring medium should have more texture in it. The water is going to be is going to level, and by leveling I mean the paint will spread out and have as little texture as possible. So the water will have very little, if any, texture. The glue, the Elmer's glue that we mixed in, that was, which one was that? I think that was the Cool Blue. I think that might have the most texture on the opposite end of it, just because of its it usually has texture when it dries anyway. If you've ever built anything, got a blop of glue on some wood that you didn't intend, you get the sander down to get rid of it, right? You know, before I go, I think I do want to put a little, well, I was going to say, what I could do is put a little bit of yellow back in at the very, very end, which might be an option if you've really layered this right up and it is like super full of paint and it's getting darker and darker. I would suggest going back in and adding just a quick little hint. Yeah, let's do that. Let's just... Okay, we'll do one more quick little mix. And this one I'm not going to put much paint in there. Let's put a little bit of the cool yellow. Not much, just a couple little drops in there. And I'll just put pouring medium back in here. It's been a while since we've used this, now that we've explored all the other different materials. You can see all these different materials. I've done essentially the same thing. It's just that we're not using them, you know, it's not their intended use. So the reason why I'm taking a bit of this yellow and bringing it back right here at the very end is, especially since I kind of simulated that yellow underneath, it just sort of makes it look like there's many, many layers of that, and it wasn't just one. Like I'm kind of hiding a little bit of my technique here by bringing some of this yellow back in here. And just like any other style of painting, the question becomes, when is it done? We haven't really talked about that yet until this point, but you know, maybe especially at this point, because it's like, well, I can just keep on going and going and going. Like, when is it going to be done? Like, I think I am going to put a little bit more black on here. I don't think I actually needed that yellow, but think it's good to really be changing and rotating these things around, just so you don't have the same mark everywhere. I mean, this is just fun. At some point, you're just like, I don't even care if it turns out. I'm just having a blast. Okay. I think I could just keep on going here, but I kind of like the way this looks. I do want to put a little bit more white here. I just feel like I'm Columbo. One more thing. So what's going to be really interesting is to see how this painting changes over the next 24 hours. When I've done this in class, and what I always ask people, write your name on the back of your canvas before you start, which obviously I didn't do today because it's just me here and I know this is mine. I don't expect anybody to sneak into the house and make another one of these. But, you know, if there's 20 people in a room and we're all making these, what ends up happening is people are like, oh, it looks really cool. And then we let them dry and they come back the next day. And what's surprising is a lot of people can't tell which one is theirs. Even if they took photos on their phones with them, they're like, huh, none of these look like the image, right? Because often as the paint settles, they start blending and changing and things get kind of wild and weird. So what I would suggest you do is take a picture of your painting right now and then take another picture tomorrow, or even take another picture every hour, depending on what, you know, if it's 9 a.m. where you are, take another picture every few hours as it dries. And I'm not saying, it's depending on what mediums you're using, it could look very, very different once it's done drying. Okay, so I think I'm going to call this done. And Deborah finished her painting in the same time as me today, right? I'm sure there's a few of you probably who may have finished much earlier than me, right? And that's what's fun too, is that when you're making these, you get to decide when it's done. It's not about like, well, how close does it look to the original? How close does it look to what I'm doing? It becomes much more personal, right? Where you kind of look at it and think like, you know what? I think it's done. I don't know. Maybe he wants to put more work. I don't want to put any black on mine. And that, I think, is when it gets really exciting. You know, we're getting towards the end of the course, and you start developing your own sense of taste and your own sense of like when a painting is finished, what you know. I always think what's most exciting about even doing any kind of painting is if you've done it once and you look at it and think like, I should have stopped 20 minutes ago. Well, you've done it once, you got it at this point, you could do it over again and you can stop at that place you wanted to stop at. In fact, I've thought about that many times looking at the Bob Ross paintings I've done. And I think, you know what, I think I should have stopped before I put the snow on things. I kind of like it before I put the snow on it. And if I was to do it a third time, that's what I would do, is I would get rid of the snow. And maybe I would change the color of the sky. Maybe I would change the color of the water. I mean, who knows what other choices I would make the second, third, fourth, fifth time around. You know, you could be like Claude Monet and do the same painting 50, 60 times, and then, like, you know, rather than which one do I like better, it's like, wow, look how many different possibilities there are just from the same basic kind of image. Okay, so just looking at those comments there. Thank you, everybody. I got very dirty hands, right? This is great. I love having dirty hands when I'm painting, right? It makes me feel like I really got into it. If at the end of a painting session I have no paint on me whatsoever, then I kind of feel like I didn't get in there as much as I really should have, right? At least if I got a little bit of paint on, I feel like I've been turning the canvas around, I've been mixing, and I kind of lost track of things. I lost track of time, I lost track of where I am, and that's how art becomes like therapy, right? You're just like, oh, I forgot all the problems I have in my life because I was just so excited about painting, right? Okay, so what do we have on tap? Our next class is oh yes, our next class is going to be a lot of fun. We are going to paint one of the most famous paintings in global art history, Hokusai's The Great Wave off of Kanagawa, which is just like Impression Sunrise by Claude Monet, equally as influential, in fact, probably more influential. Hokusai and a number of the other Japanese artists of that time had like their influence on Western art, not just influence on Eastern art, but on Western art is so like almost immeasurable. Like, you wouldn't have Van Gogh, and if you didn't have because Van Gogh was very much inspired by art coming out of Japan at the time, because Japan was opening, I think, was Japan opening at that time or closing? I think opening. And when artists like Van Gogh and the Impressionists saw the art that was coming out of Japan, and because a lot of Japanese artists were doing printmaking, that it made that art travel really easily. You'd have collectors go there, and you could have 10 different people buy the same print, and they'd all come back, and then all these artists in Paris and Berlin and London, less so in New York and Toronto and stuff, but in those major European centers saw this work, like their minds just exploded, right? Because just like you could see when we talked about the Impressionists last week, and kind of the kind of art that was being produced in the salons and the academies at the time, very conservative art. And there's nothing wrong with it, but they were 20-something, young 30-year-old guys. A few women were allowed to participate. And just like any young teenager or young artist, they wanted to do the exact opposite of what's going on, right? So those Japanese artists kind of blew open the doors, and we'll talk about what it was about that art that revolutionized art. So anyway, I'm excited for that. I've been wanting to do a painting of that for a while, so we're going to finally tackle another one of my favorite artists. Okay, everybody, so enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for joining me for looking at this fantastic artist, JeanPaul Riopelle, and maybe by painting an artist like this and doing a little bit of abstract painting or non-representational painting, non-figurative, non-objective painting, however you want to think about it, has maybe made you look at this type of art a little bit differently. So next time you see some of this art in a museum, and if you've tried to paint it, you might be a little bit less likely to sneer at it when you realize how difficult it is to do and how much fun it is to do as well. So we're going to see you guys in a couple of days. Enjoy yourself until then. Bye-bye, everybody.